Hi class, our next lesson is 6-4. We're solving quadratic equations by completing the square in this lesson. So make sure you put away all distractions with this lesson. It definitely takes a lot of thought and a lot of concentration to solve these problems. So put away any other distractions that you might have, and let's focus on these notes here for a while. So for this first one, we want to solve for x, and the way we're going to do that is when we have a binomial squared, we can square root both sides of the equation. And now we just get what's inside the parentheses, which is x minus 3. So the square root of something squared, those cancel out, and we just have x plus 3. That equals the square root of 16. Now remember, the square root of 16 is 4, but it's also a negative 4. So we're going to have two different answers, x plus 3 equals 4, and x plus 3 equals a negative 4. You might hear it say x plus 3 equals plus and minus 4. So let's divide it up like that, and we're going to get two different answers. X equals 1 when we subtract 3 from both sides, and x equals a negative 7 when we subtract 3 from both sides. So that's the answer to problem number 1. If you guys take a look at this, you could always check your work. You could put 1 back in here for x. 1 plus 3 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. And there it is right there. You can do the same thing for negative 7. Negative 7 plus 3 is a negative 4, and a negative 4 squared is also a positive 16. So you can check your work. Why don't you guys try number 2? Pause the video, try this one on your own. Again, like problem number 1, you should have square rooted both sides. So you get x minus 4 equals the square root of 20, and x minus 4 equals the negative square root of 20. So if you break down the radical, this is 5 times 4. So x minus 4 equals 2 square root 5. You could take out the 4 as a 2. So x minus 4 equals a negative 2 square root 5. And then to solve for x, getting x all by itself, we need to add 4 to both sides. So x equals 4 plus 2 square root 5. There's one of our answers. And x equals adding 4 minus 2 square root 5. So these are your two answers for this one. Just to let you know in accelerated math, if you see x equals 4 plus and minus 2 square root 5, that's the same thing as what I have in these. I'll accept either of those on the test. Okay, so just to let you know. So now for problem number 3, I don't have a binomial squared. But the purpose of completing the square is to solve just like we did with 1 and 2. We get a binomial squared, we square root both sides. We get a binomial squared, we square root both sides. Now, on problem number 3, and throughout the rest of the notes, our process is to complete the square so we can get a binomial squared. So here's how you do that. First, get x squared and x on one side of the equation, and get the constant off to the other side. So here's our constant term. Let's add 20 to both sides. So now we have x squared plus 8x equals 20. Okay, now once we have it right here, class, this is the spot where we're going to put in our blank, because we're going to complete the square by filling in a blank. So what that means, class, is once you have it up to here, now write in the next line, x squared plus 8x plus a blank equals 20 plus a blank. We're going to put a number into this blank, and with any equation, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side to still make it equal. So in this blank is always b divided by 2 squared. So here's our a value, here's our b value, here's our c value. So in this green blank right here, and in this green blank right here, is the number b divided by 2 squared. So in this example, our b value is 8, so it's 8 divided by 2 squared. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So I'm going to put a 16 in this blank, and I'm going to put a 16 in this blank. Here's the reason for that, class. Don't write down this next part that I'm going to write down. Okay, just watch me really quick. This is a trinomial, and it factors into x and x. And then the 16 makes 4 and 4, and it's going to be x plus 4 times x plus 4. Notice how this is a binomial times a binomial, and the binomials are the exact same. So I can write that down as x plus 4 times x plus 4, or I can write that down as x plus 4 quantity squared. That's what I want you guys to write down in your notes now. this right here becomes x plus 4 quantity squared. Here's how you can always do that. It's always the square root of this number is the first term in the binomial, so the square root of x squared is x. This number in the second in the second term of the binomial is always b divided by 2, or 8 divided by 2. And then whatever the sign is in front of b is what your sign is going to be in your binomial. So it's x plus 4 times x plus 4, or x plus 4 quantity squared. That equals 20 plus 16, which is 36. So here now we have x plus 4 squared equals 36. Now it looks very similar to problem number 1 and number 2. We're going to solve for x by taking the square root of both sides. So x plus 4 equals the square root of 36, which is 6. And x plus 4 equals a negative 6. It's plus and minus the square root of 36, or plus and minus 6. So subtract 4 from both sides, x equals 2. Subtract 4 from both sides, x equals a negative 10. Here is our answer for problem number 3. X equals 2 and x equals a negative 10. At any point, if you want to check your work, you just put those values right back in here for x, and you should get the left side equaling the right side. Why don't you guys try number 4, pause the video, and then check your work after you're done. So here's what you should have done. You should have got x squared plus 4x equals 12, because you want to get your constants off to the other side. Once you have your x squared term and your x term on the left side, now you're going to put in your blank. So x squared plus 4x plus a blank, that equals 12 plus a blank. Inside the blank is b divided by 2 quantity squared. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So what you add to one side, you must add to the other. So you're going to add 4 to both sides. Now, in my opinion, this is the hardest part. So this part here to get to the next line, it's always going to be a binomial squared. The binomial is always going to have the same sign that's in front of b, so it's going to have the positive sign. And then it's going to be the square root of this number, which is x, and that's what it usually is. It's usually x that goes there. And then in the second term is always b divided by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. So this trinomial is the same thing as x plus 2 times x plus 2, or x plus 2 quantity squared. That equals 16. Alright, finishing this up, you would get x plus 2 when you square root both sides equals 4, and x plus 2 equals a negative 4. So that means x equals 2 when you subtract 2 from both sides, and x equals a negative 6 when you subtract 2 from both sides. So hopefully that's what you got for problem number 4. On numbers 3 and numbers 4, we could have got these two answers by factoring, and it would have been a lot easier, a lot quicker. Okay? Same thing with this one. You could factor this trinomial, and you would end up getting the answer of x equals 2 and x equals a negative 6. So you wouldn't want to complete the square on problems that you could factor. However, when we get to the rest of the problems on our notes today, those ones cannot be factored. So that's why we learn the process of completing the square, so we can still solve for x even when we cannot factor. Okay, number 5 jumps up a big level of difficulty. The reason why is because we're dealing with fractions. How do we feel about them? I'm sure you're thinking this. I love fractions. Look at this guy's forehead right now. That's hilarious, right? He has the pi symbol ingrained in his forehead when he's kind of wrinkles his nose there and kind of looks angry. He gets some wrinkles on his forehead, looks like the pi symbol. It's great. The reason why we're going to have fractions in this lesson, in the rest of these problems here, class, is because we have a coefficient in front of our x squared. On the previous few problems, we haven't had that coefficient. So let's look at how we do this with this coefficient. We're still going to get our constant off to the other side. So we want our squared term, which is 2x squared, and our x term on one side of the equation with our constants on the other side. So that's a negative 3. Now, once you have this, whenever you have a coefficient other than 1 in front of your x squared term, you cannot complete the square until you get rid of that 2, or factor it out in front. So now we're going to have this, 2 times the quantity. You took a 2 out of this, so all you have left is x squared. If you take a 2 out of this, you got to take a 2 out of this as well. So minus 5 halves x. Okay, That equals a negative 3. So we haven't changed anything. We just factored the 2 out in front, and now we have x squared minus 5 halves x left on the left side. Now you're ready to complete the square. You have a positive 1 in front of your x squared term, and you have the x squared and x on the left side, and you have your constants on the other. So we're going to complete the square by going like this. Keep that 2 over there, and then you're going to have x squared minus 5 halves x plus a blank. That equals a negative 3 plus a blank. Okay, in the blank is b divided by 2 quantity squared. So now we're going to have these fractions that come into play. So it's 5 halves divided by 2. You could do this in your calculator, but it's the same thing as 5 halves times 1/4, or times 1/2. 5 halves times 1/2 is 5/4, and then 5/4 squared is 25/16. So you can do that in your calculator. I have no problem with that. But when you take 5 halves divided by 2 and square it, you would get 25/16. Now, when you add 25/16 to this side, don't write down this now, class. Oftentimes people say, well, I got to add 25/16 to this side. And they're incorrect. That's not what you do on this problem. You added 25/16 to the left side, but you actually added 2 times 25/16. You have to distribute this 2 out in front. So instead of adding 25/16, it's 2 times 25/16, which is 50/16, or 25/8. That's what you add to this side is 25/8. You got to make sure that you distribute this 2 when you add it over to here. Okay, now that we're at this point, it's 2 times a binomial squared. The binomial always has the sign in front of b in the middle of those two terms. It always has the square root of this term, which is x, and then it's always b divided by 2 for the second term of the binomial. So 5 halves divided by 2 is 5/4. So 2 times the quantity x minus 5/4 quantity squared, that equals a negative 3 plus 25/8. When you do that in your calculator, you would get 1/8. Okay, now that we're up to here, we're solving for x. So our first step in solving for x is to get rid of that coefficient, which means divide by 2. When you divide by 2, do that to both sides, which is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal or multiplying by 1/2. So now this is gone. You just get x minus 5/4 quantity squared. That equals 1/8 times 1/2 is 1/16. Now we're going to square root both sides. There we go. And we get x minus 5/4 equals plus and minus the square root of 1/16. Square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 16 is 4. So x minus 5/4 equals 1/4, and x minus 5/4 equals a negative 1/4. Almost done. Add 5/4 to both sides. So x equals 1/4 plus 5/4 is 6/4. 6/4 reduces to 3 halves. So one of our answer is x equals 3 halves. The other one, a negative 1/4 plus 5/4 is 4/4. We're adding 5/4 to both sides. And 4/4 is the same thing as 1. So our answer here is x equals 3 halves and x equals 1. So I guess this one could have been factored as well, but it's very beneficial to learn how to complete the square. Why don't you guys pause the video and try number 6 on your own. So here's how you should have done number 6. You should have had 3x squared minus 2x equals 1. Make sure you get the constant off to the right side. Now you got to get rid of this 3, so factor it out in front. So it's 3 times the quantity, x squared minus 2/3 x, that equals 1. Okay, now you're ready to complete your square. So you want to get your blanks. 3 times the quantity, x squared minus 2/3 x plus a blank, that equals 1 plus a blank. Continuing forward, our blank is b divided by 2 squared. So it's 2/3 divided by 2 squared. 2/3 divided by 2 is 1/3, and 1/3 squared is a 1/9. So we add 1/9 there, and then we're actually adding 3 times 1/9 to the left side, so 3 times 1/9 is 3/9 or 1/3. So you actually added 1/3 to the left side, so you have to add 1/3 to the right side as well. Okay, now we bring down to the next line. We have 3 times a binomial squared. The binomial is going to have a negative sign in it, because this sign is a negative sign. The square root of x squared is x, so that's going to be our first term. And then b divided by 2 is this term. So 2/3 divided by 2 is 1/3. So x minus 1/3, that quantity squared. That equals 1 plus 1/3 is 4/3. That's what we get on the right side. All right, now next line. We're going to divide both sides by 3. So when we divide both sides by 3, it's x minus 1/3 quantity squared. That equals, dividing by 3 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/3. We would end up getting 4/9. Okay, now that we have that, we square root both sides. That would get rid of the squared term right here, so we just get x minus 1/3. That equals plus and minus the square root of 4/9. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. So it's plus and minus 2/3. X minus 1/3 also equals the negative 2/3. Finish up by solving. Add 1/3 to both sides. 2/3 plus 1/3 is 3/3. So x equals 1 is one of our answers. Continuing, add 1/3 to both sides. A negative 2/3 plus 1/3 is a negative 1/3. Our two answers for problem number 6 is x equals 1 and x equals a negative 1/3. Just as a reminder, class, if you ever want to check your work, you certainly can. Put 1 and negative 1/3 into these x's and see if the left side equals the right side. If you do it correctly, that's the way it should work. Number 7, let's try this one. If we add 7 to both sides, we get 2x squared plus 4x equals 7. Get rid of our constants off to the right. Now let's get rid of this coefficient. 2 times the quantity x squared plus 2x. That equals 7. Now you're ready to complete the square. You have your x squared and your x term on the left. You have your constants onto the right, and you have a positive 1 in front of your x squared. Once you're to this step, you're always ready for your blank. So now it's 2 times the quantity x squared plus 2x plus a blank. That equals 7 plus a blank. Hopefully you're getting more familiar with how these blanks work now. It's always b divided by 2 squared. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. Hiya! We're actually adding 2 because it's 2 times 1. So off on the right, you're adding 2 over there. Okay, here we go. We have 2 times the binomial squared. That binomial squared is going to have a positive sign because the sign in front of b is positive. It's going to have an x in the first term, and b divided by 2 is the second term. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So x plus 1 quantity squared. That equals 7 plus 2, which is 9. Almost done. Divide both sides by 2. So x plus 1 quantity squared equals 9 halves. Once you get 9 halves there, you then have to square root both sides. Square root both sides. So we get x plus 1 equals plus and minus the square root of 9 halves. So that's kind of like saying the square root of 9 divided by the square root of 2. And we all know what the square root of 9 is. The square root of 9 is 3. So it's kind of like saying 3 divided by the square root of 2. X plus 1 equals that, and x plus 1 equals a negative 3 divided by square root 2. Now we can't have radicals in our answers, so we need to rationalize the denominator, multiply both top and bottom by square root 2. So then we get x plus 1 equals 3 square root 2 over 2. In the same way on the other equation, it's x plus 1 equals a negative 3 square root 2 over 2. Almost done. We just have to subtract 1 from both sides. So our answer on this one, as ugly as it may be, x equals a negative 1 plus 3 square root 2 divided by 2. And the other answer is x equals a negative 1 minus 3 square root 2 divided by 2. negative 1 plus 3 is the square root of 2 divided by 2, and a negative 1 minus 3 square root of 2 divided by 2. So these answers are definitely kind of ugly, especially the ones when you cannot factor. That's the purpose of completing the square. Just to let you know, class, sometimes they like to have the denominator be the same thing. So if we want to make this as a denominator over 2, it would be x equals, we'd still get this 3 square root 2 divided by 2, but then this would be a negative 2 instead of a negative 1. So now everything is all over 2. So you might see this in accelerated math as well. It's the exact same thing as what you see right here. Okay, last one. You guys try it on your own. Oh, I must have missed it. There it is, number 7. Why don't you guys pause the video and try this one on your own. So you should have got x squared plus 2x equals a negative 19. X squared plus 2x plus a blank equals a negative 19 plus a blank. This one's kind of nice that you don't have a coefficient in front of your x squared term, so that does make these ones a lot easier. So in the blank is b divided by 2 squared. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So you add 1 to the left side, you got to add 1 to the right side. So now we get a binomial squared. It's going to be a plus sign. X plus b divided by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. X plus 1 quantity squared, that equals a negative 18. Onward, we got to square root both sides to get x plus 1 all by itself. When we square root of negative 18, the square root of negative 18 is 2 times 9 times a negative 1. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 2 is left underneath the radical. So x plus 1 equals 3i square root 2, as well as x plus 1 equals a negative 3i square root 2. And then we subtract 1 from both sides. So your answer should be x equals a negative 1 plus 3i square root 2, and x equals a negative 1 minus 3i square root 2. And those are your two answers for problem number 7. So hopefully completing the square went well for you. There are a lot of questions with this lesson, so please don't feel bad if you don't understand something fully. I would love to help you out in class tomorrow, so be sure to ask me if you have any questions.